Hi Year 8, hope you're all good. So we've got two lessons this week. The first lesson that you're doing today is going to be sort of gathering evidence and preparing for a discussion that we will be having on Friday in our first ever Zoom lesson, which I'm very excited about and hopefully you're looking forward to as well. So basically what we're doing today and Friday and the next couple of weeks is we are going to be getting you ready for your last sort of big assessment, your last essay of Year 8. Now, obviously, normal way of things is you would be sitting an exam round about now. That can't happen for obvious reasons. So instead, we're going to work towards writing this essay at home, and we're going to give you lots and lots of time to work on that and sort of get ready for that, and hopefully get you in a position where you can do really, really well and just show off how fantastic at history you have all become. So that essay is going to be answering this question, which is how far do you agree that Haig deserves to be called a butcher as a result of his leadership during the First World War? So just to remind you who Haig is, there he is. He was the Field Marshal, so the commander in charge of the British Army during battles such as the Somme and a few others sort of before and afterwards as well. So he was a major commander during World War One. Now, as we'll talk about in just a minute, he sometimes gets quite a bad reputation. He is referred to as being a butcher. Okay, and we'll talk about what that might mean in a second. But essentially, being blamed for the deaths of thousands and thousands of people, and the sort of the suggestion is that perhaps those deaths did not need to happen at all, and that actually it was just Haig being a bit incompetent that led to that. So your essay is going to be you trying to decide whether that's fair, whether Haig really was incompetent and a butcher and to blame for all those deaths, or whether actually perhaps that's a bit unfair and he did as good a job as he could have done. Okay, so today we're going to be getting some evidence to get you ready to answer that, and then when we see each other on Friday, we're going to be talking through that evidence and kind of discussing how we might turn that into an essay. So today's title is this: Haig, Butcher or Hero. So get that down into your books now, and then we'll move on. Okay, so before we can do this, we've got three key words we need to understand, or I suppose one of them's a phrase, really. And these are all things that when we're learning about Haig and his actions are really important to think about. Okay, and the first of those is war of attrition, okay, which is a certain type of fighting. Now, normally, when you have a war, we would assume it ends because one side is better than the other, and they win a big battle, and that's the end of the war, and the other side surrender and give up. A war of attrition is what World War One was, essentially. It's a little bit different to that. It's basically a war, and the way you win is not necessarily by being the best, but by holding out the longest. All right, so you keep fighting, but you just don't give up, and eventually your enemy gets so sort of ground down that they give up first. All right, because they get fed up with it. So it's about just holding your ground as long as possible and trying to kind of outlast your enemy. Okay, and obviously to do that, normally you have to lose a lot of men. Because the whole idea is you just keep fighting and fighting and fighting no matter how hard it gets. So a war of attrition, it's not a very nice kind of war, all right, but it's the kind of war that essentially World War One became, because both sides were so evenly matched that really the only way to win was just to stick it out the longest and take the most loss and accept the most death, which is what happened in World War One. And obviously, it's very sad because that kind of war results in a lot of people dying. Okay, so that's what a war of attrition is. It's when you just hold out for as long as you can. The second key word is morale. Now, we've heard this word before, but just to remind you what it means, morale is basically your confidence, your spirits, your enthusiasm. Now, if your morale is low, you're not going to try as hard. Okay, if you're not really into something, you don't really feel good about something, you're not very confident in it, you don't believe in it, you are not going to try. All right, but if your morale is good, you're like, yes, we can do this. You're feeling confident and excited, then you're going to try harder. You're probably going to do better. So in a war, what's really important to do is keep morale high. You need to keep your soldiers feeling good, feeling confident and feeling enthusiastic, because otherwise they'll stop fighting as well. They might start deserting and sort of leaving, giving up, at which point obviously it's quite difficult to win. So you've got to keep morale high to stop people surrendering. The final keyword is obviously very important for our question today, which is butcher. Now, we all know what a butcher is, in a shop. It's where you buy meat. They cut meat up for you. But what we mean here is it's kind of the way butcher can be used as an insult. Okay, so in this case, a butcher is someone who just kills without caring. Who kills with, they don't need to and they don't even care about it. And, a little bit like a butcher, they spend all day chopping up dead animals, but they don't feel sad about it, because it's their job, they don't care. All right, if you describe someone as a butcher, they are someone who kills without caring, who potentially kills without needing to. All right, they just don't care, they almost enjoy it. Okay, that's what a butcher is. So that's what some people claim Haig was. He was just a butcher. He just let people die and he didn't care. And he didn't need to, but he just didn't care enough to avoid it. So, on to our main task then. So Haig's, it's very difficult to make a decision about Haig because it's over 100 years ago now. And he is often called, and certainly after the war, he was referred to as a butcher. Someone that was responsible for a huge amount of death. Okay, at the Battle of the Somme, obviously we know 20,000 men died the very first day. Overall, getting on for 1 million men, if you take together all the casualties, became casualties in that battle. And that's not the only battle he was in charge of. The Battle of the Loos, 50,000 men died. A year before, a lot of people died, okay, under Haig's leadership. So people say, okay, he's a butcher. However, more modern historians have been a little bit nicer about it. They said, actually, you know what? He was in a very difficult situation. It's not the kind of thing you deal with every day, is it? A world war. And the technology wasn't there and the tactics weren't there. And, it was the first ever world war. And that actually, in a very difficult situation, he did pretty well. And frankly, not many people would have done anything different. Anyone at the time in his position would probably have behaved very similarly. So let's just have a look at the evidence for both sides before I get you to go and look at this in more detail. Let's start by looking at the evidence for butcher. Okay, what tells us that Haig was a butcher? And there's some very talented photoshopping going on there. Okay, well, number one, he doesn't change his tactics, right? So the Battle of the Somme, it's 5 months long, okay? 141 attacks are made in that time, and they are all pretty much the exact same. Pretty much the same tactic he tried on day one. You've had the big bombardment, send your men over to finish the job. As we saw, the bombardment didn't really work. Thousands and thousands were killed, and actually it wasn't very effective. So, hey, maybe he should have changed his tactic. However, he didn't. He just kept sending them over for months. And obviously that resulted in thousands and thousands and thousands of men being killed, just by going over the top and being machine gunned down. So that's not great. And almost the worst thing is that he actually made that mistake before. So, I mentioned the Battle of the Loos, 1915, 50,000 men were killed, and it was the exact same thing. He tried an artillery bombardment, it wasn't successful, but he sent the men over the top anyway. So, that's not ideal, is it? But being so sort of stubborn and not changing your tactics, even when it's very clear they aren't really working, and resulting in death. Now, of course, while this is all going on, while these men are being ordered at the top to be machine gunned down, to be blown up, he is 40 miles away. All right, he's in France, he's close to the trenches, but he's miles away. He's not on the front line. He's miles back, nice and safe, staying in a nice little French chateau, sort of French sort of fancy mansion, drinking wine, eating cheese, issuing orders while the men are dying. That's not brilliant, is it? He didn't know what was going on because he wasn't there. He was so far away. That's not great leadership. Now, this isn't really to do with the battles, but it's another thing that Haig did that wasn't great, which is, so at the time, if you commit a crime or you break army rules, the punishment, in particular cases, was to be shot. It was to be tied to a post and shot at dawn by a firing squad of other men. And the British army shot a lot of their men as punishment. And a lot of those men, and in Haig's case, 306 soldiers that he directly signed the death warrant for, they were shot for being cowards, for cowardice. But obviously we know now that they weren't cowards. Okay, so here's an image of a man suffering. They had something that at the time they called shell shock. Okay, but we now know it's actually just PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a mental illness. When you have experienced extreme trauma, like, fighting in a trench in World War One, it does something to your mind. And these men, they weren't wimps. They were shaking, they were crying, they couldn't talk, they couldn't move, they couldn't sleep. And that wasn't because they were scared, it was because they had a mental disorder. All right? And nowadays we are much better at dealing with these kinds of mental health problems. Okay, we're much more accepting and understanding. But in the 1910s, when the war was happening, that was not the case. Mental health was really not something that anybody really cared about very much, or certainly didn't understand. And so those men were shot for being cowards when they were suffering from mental health problems. And Haig was responsible for that. So, that's not great, is it? That's not great. And of course, finally, we have that very classic phrase, lions led by donkeys. All right, was Haig a donkey? And did he lead lions, brave British troops, to their deaths because he was foolish and incompetent? And certainly there were lots of mistakes made. Right, we've seen that at the Somme. The way that artillery bombardment just completely failed. Can we blame him for that? Okay, but the case for the defence then. So, that's all the evidence he was a butcher. What about the evidence he was perhaps actually a hero? Okay, because actually some people do remember him this way. So let's look at that. Well, to be fair to him, all right, it was 100 years ago. All right, he was as good as he could have been in those circumstances. They didn't have, phones in the same way that we do. They didn't have email. They couldn't text each other, do a little Zoom call to let each other know how things were going on. Communications were rubbish. It was really hard to get information from one place to another. Very slow as well. So it was very hard for him to know exactly what was going on. And a lot of the time he got what we would call bad intelligence. Okay, so intelligence is kind of the reports and information that you get to make your decisions. So he got intelligence that the Germans were going to give up any day. And therefore, yes, keep fighting. That's the way to do this. Just keep going because they're going to give up any day now. Now, as we know, that wasn't quite true. But to be fair to Haig, that was the information he had. All right, and as I said, most people, any man really that you put in that position at the time, probably would have behaved much the same because they can only work with what they know. Now, similarly, and this is the hard thing, all right, a lot of people judge Haig because of the sheer numbers of men that died. Okay. And that, obviously, death is awful. Death is always awful. Thousands of men dying is not a good thing. But, and this is where that phrase, war of attrition, comes in. Remember we talked about why World War I became a stalemate a few weeks ago? And basically the problem is that both sides were pretty evenly matched. All right, they broadly had the same technology, they had the same tactics. The only advantage the British and the French, the Allies, the only advantage they had was numbers. They had more men, okay, and they were getting lots more recruits every day. And in a case where you're not necessarily better, you've just got more men. And remember, a lot of the British soldiers had only been quite recently recruited, so they weren't very experienced. The only way you can win in that case is by a war of attrition. You just keep going. You just keep sending wave after wave after wave of soldiers in, and eventually the other side gets tired and give up. All right, and that's the only, if you couldn't actually have any other advantage, that's the only option available to you. And obviously the trouble with that strategy is people die. People die in their thousands. But maybe they didn't have a choice. That was the only advantage they had. All they could do was just keep sending in more men and hope the Germans eventually got tired. Can we blame Haig for that? It's the sad reality of war. People do die. Now, if we look at Haig's other record, yes, we say he made some mistakes at the Somme, but actually in other parts of the war, he was really good. He was really successful. So, for instance, at the beginning, he won things like the Battle of the Mons, the Battle of the Marne, these key battles that helped to end the Schlieffen Plan and stop them taking France. Right at the start of the war, he had a big part to play in that. And to be fair, even with the Somme, it did achieve what it was meant to. It relieved the pressure on Verdun, they gained some ground, and they killed a lot of Germans. That was what they wanted to do. And in fact, the Germans themselves agreed the Somme. It was bad for us, but it was bad for them too. One German described it as the muddy grave of the German army, because they lost so many men, they could never recover. They could never get those troops back. It broke their morale. It made them realise perhaps the Allies were stronger than they thought. And yes, it cost us untold numbers of men. It was a terrible tragedy, but fundamentally it did what it was supposed to do, just at a terrible cost. And finally, Haig, we've said he was slow to change his tactics. He was, but he did do it eventually. He did, he was one of the first British generals to start pushing to use tanks. He was one of the first British generals to start using planes to kind of get aerial views and aerial shots to see what was going on as scouts. And at the end of the war, he leads something. And so 1918, the final year of the war, which we haven't studied yet, but we are getting to, there's something called the 100-Day Offensive. Okay, where in 100 days, as the name would suggest, the Allies finally push the Germans out of France. They destroy their final line of defences and get rid of them. All right, and that ultimately causes the Germans to surrender and ends the war. So fundamentally, Haig led the troops that won the war. Right, in the end, he was the guy in charge that caused the Germans to surrender. So really, that's a pretty big achievement. Really. Okay, even if we accept that perhaps there was a lot of loss along the way, he did ultimately get the Germans to surrender. I don't know. So, and one other thing he did, I just remember this little poppy, is every year in November we wear poppies for the 1 minute silent. The charity that sells those is called the British Legion, and that is a charity that exists to help the families and retired soldiers after a war. Okay, it exists to help them. The British Legion was set up by Haig. He created that charity. At the end of the war, he didn't just give up and put his feet up. He created a new charity to help the families of soldiers who'd been killed, to help soldiers who'd been injured, and they came up with the idea of selling poppies. And if you look, this is an original poppy, okay, from just after the war. You can see it looks a bit different to what we wear now. And look at this label, Earl Haig's Appeal for ex-servicemen of all ranks and their dependents. Okay, so literally the poppies that we wear now, that was started by an appeal by a charity that Haig set up. So, is it fair to say he was a butcher who didn't care about people dying? So, as I say, guys, what you're going to do is you're going to look at this evidence in a little bit more depth, and then we'll talk about it together on Friday. You have got a card sort that looks like this. What I would like you to do is one of two things. Now, if you can print it off, and then I want you to colour code. If you can't print it, draw 2 columns and copy the information in. All right, but basically, you're going to sort these cards into 2 categories. Evidence Haig was a butcher, and evidence Haig was a hero. Okay, and as I say, you can either use it with 2 colours, or you can just write it into a table in your book. Okay, so for instance, if we look at the first one, after the war, Haig was given 100k and made an earl. He spent the rest of his life raising money for the men wounded in the war, creating the British Legion, who still sell poppies today. Now, to me, that sounds pretty heroic. Raising all that money for soldiers who suffered, rather than just enjoying his money. That sounds like a heroic action. However, if we look at another one of these cards, so let's go over here. Too often, British attacks were poorly planned. Shells didn't explode. For example, 1/3 of the shells launched at the Somme did not work, and the barbed wire wasn't broken. Yet, Haig repeated the same tactics. He didn't have any alternative plans. Now, if we're sorting that into one of these categories, well, it's not very heroic, is it? The technology failing, the barbed wire not breaking, so the plan completely going wrong, and still sending your men over and over to die, even though your plan has failed, rather than coming up with a new plan. Not ideal. All right, so I think we'd probably sort that into the butcher category. All right, so you're going to do that process with all of these cards, decide which of the 2 pieces of evidence they work into. Okay, and as I say, you can either colour code them, or you can draw this table in your book, give yourself a full page, and copy the information into the relevant column. And as I say, on Friday, when we meet for our Zoom lesson, we can go through this information together. All right, guys, I will see you in a few days' time. Have a nice day.